ces femmes. Les questions de ces premiers mouvements de femmes, eh bien, on les retrouve au point de départ des trois approches qui vont être discutées maintenant, c'est-à-dire qu'elles ne sont pas encore distinguées à ce moment-là et qu'elles répondent toutes, à partir de cette question de la citoyenneté et de l'identité, aux questions qui suis-je, où vais-je et pourquoi. Mais elles sont toutes confrontées à une question commune qui est en quelque sorte le noyau dur, qui est de savoir dans quelle mesure, en quelque sorte, l'islam poserait-il une inégalité entre les femmes et les hommes. Ça allait? Okay.
Okay, now there's one other event in the 20th century which is important to the conversation I want to have about these three major voices. And this is something that happened here in Europe, which were two terrible world wars. Now, the world wars showed us that we were capable as human beings of doing horrible things to other human beings, irrespective of our shared humanity. And as a consequence of this, the United Nations was formed. And the United Nations has before itself and had before itself an expressed interest in establishing a notion of universal human rights. In order to have universal human rights, you first have to come to some understanding of what it means to be a human being. And this did not begin in the 20th century. All major world religions, all philosophies grappled with what it means to be a human being. So some people, I think, are confused that with the establishment of the United Nations, with its explicit self-mandate of articulating universal human rights, that somehow human rights came into being in the middle of the 20th century, but rather a united effort to be able to think about this in contradistinction to atrocities that have been perpetuated against other human beings by human beings precipitated the United Nations agenda, but the idea of a human being had already existed. So in one hand, there is a coordination of an understanding of what it means to be a human being and therefore what rights should be available to one as a human being, even if you are at war with that human being or the nation states that represent the origins of that human being. But the idea of what it means to be human didn't start there. And sometimes this gets to be confused because, of course, for many parts of the world, many third world countries, Africa, Asia, Latin America, South America, there was an imposition of certain ideas about what it means to be a human being on their ideas about what it is to be a human being, developed from their own religions and philosophies. And this is still being contested today. So one of the things that needs to happen sometimes is to interrogate the origins of the very inspiration to establish universal human rights. And I think overall, I think it's a good thing, but it is not something that is without contestation. And the basis of that contestation is that peoples of the world had an idea of what it means to be a human being, but certain ideas were codified in these international documents. So I'm going to fast forward from the establishment of the UN and to a very specific time, because this allows me to talk about the three major voices much more coherently. In 1995, at the Global Women's Forum on Human Rights, Muslim women from various nation states were present in greater and more noticeable numbers than at any of the previous forum. What's interesting is they kind of recognized that they were there, so they decided, well, we should form a caucus, a Muslim women's caucus. And all they did was shout at each other at each one of these meetings. So I stayed away. I went to see the Korean ladies do traditional dance. And the reason why they were at such loggerheads is because there were two major players present at the conference in Beijing. One was the Islamist voice, which is connected to the political Islamic movements that hopefully you know about, coming into being at the end of the 20th century out of frustration for many reasons with regard to persecution as religiously oriented people and the like. But at Beijing, interestingly enough, they were often represented by men who handed out literature that spoke about the wisdom behind Islam's position on women. And so the Islamist voice was very well funded, very well supported, met up face-to-face with women who were also very well funded and very well supported, who said, basically, religion must be kept out of the debates of women's rights, including Muslim women's rights. So there were Muslim women who represented the human rights agenda by saying that religion needs to be kept out. From this point forward, I will refer to these as secular Muslim feminists, keeping in mind that, again, there is a variety, but the manifestation at Beijing of these two voices, secular Muslim women and Islamist women and men, came to a consensus which I found very interesting. For them, all Muslim women had to make a choice. They either had to choose human rights or choose Islam. Of course, the Islamists said it's a no-brainer. We choose Islam. International human rights is made by the West. It's another form of imperialism. It's another form of colonialism. We don't want to have anything to do with it. And of course, the secular feminists said Islam is the problem. We need to keep it out of the debates. In Islam, a woman can never be equal, and therefore we must go with the international documents like the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's the only way that we're going to have equality even within our own nation states.
Just one question to make sure, 1995 it was the Beijing conference, right?
Yes.
Okay, just to make sure. Deux événements, la Première et la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, ont mené à la fondation des Nations Unies et en particulier donc à la Déclaration des droits humains universels. Ce qui ne veut pas dire pour autant qu'il n'y avait pas de définition préalable de ce qu'était un être humain. Le terme n'était pas utilisé mais d'une anthropologie, c'est-à-dire que les différentes sociétés avaient déjà des idées de ce qui constituait un être humain. La spécificité de ce qui s'est joué à ce moment-là, c'était la coordination d'un ensemble de pays pour essayer de définir ces droits humains. Mais en même temps, ça a pu apparaître comme une imposition, non pas tant des droits humains eux-mêmes que de ce que ça veut dire que d'être un être humain dans d'autres continents. Pour éclairer ceci, le point de départ pourrait être 1995 et la conférence de Pékin sur les femmes, où les musulmanes se sont regroupées en un caucus avec deux logiques opposées, mais également fortement soutenues. L'une qui est celle de l'islamisme, qui était portée par des femmes, mais aussi particulièrement par des hommes, et qui correspond à un mouvement politique qui s'est développé à la fin du XXe siècle. Et face à cela, il y avait un mouvement de femmes féministes pour qui la religion devait être maintenue à distance. Et en fait, on peut considérer que ces deux mouvements, islamistes et féministes, se retrouvaient d'accord sur un point, c'est qu'il fallait choisir, que les femmes musulmanes devaient choisir soit le camp des droits humains, soit le camp de l'islam. Et des deux côtés, on semblait trouver que l'alternative était simple et qu'il n'y avait qu'à choisir.
Now, I was present in 1995 with an organization that I helped to form called Sisters in Islam from Malaysia. I was living in Malaysia when it was formulated. I'm not from Malaysia, I'm from the United States. But we were really frustrated to be there because although in some ways we felt we were representing a large majority of Muslim women who did not want to choose the either-or, either choose Islam or choose human rights. But we didn't really have an established methodology, set of objectives, and we had not made a coherent application of what this would mean on the ground. And also we encountered a great deal of resistance. The Islamist women and men basically said, because we were also striving for human rights, that we were just like secular feminists, which is one reason why I resisted the term for so long. The secular Muslim feminists said that we were just Islamists because we weren't giving up Islam. So what really came to stake was how we arrived at a challenge to the idea that you must make a choice between Islam and human rights. And the only way to come to that was to actually do an operation of epistemology. Who defines Islam and who defines human rights? And if at the end of the day we actually do have full agency, then we are also the makers of the definitions of Islam, and we are makers of the definitions of human rights. So it was our task in the next 20 years or so to actually come up with a coherent articulation of not only what this means, but how you put this into application. So we didn't have the support of international bodies because we were seen as too Islamist. We didn't have the support of the Wahhabi Salafi money because we were seen as secular feminists, but we had heart and we persevered. I want to try to clarify what it means to take agency with regard to any definition of any term that you will use or reject. And to do that, I think probably I will just fast forward to September 11th, 2001, because on September 11, 2001, very few Muslim men in the name of Islam performed an act which pretty much everybody agrees was horrible, putting to the test the notion of Islam itself. Whose Islam were they naming? And the results of that act, just in case you are not familiar with it, is that my country decided to invade two Muslim majority countries, Iran and Afghanistan, in the name of democracy, human rights, and women's rights. Okay? So it becomes very clear then that if you do not take agency with regard to these grand scale terms, Islam, human rights, women's rights, if you don't take agency with regard to them, then somebody else will not only be defining them for you, and the end result is that they will be defining who you are. Now, Muslim women are not raised to think of themselves as full agents of the meaning of Islam. We are taught, and Muslim men are taught too, but there is a disadvantage because history was on their side. We were taught that Islam is something clearly codified everywhere, that everybody agrees to, and a good Muslim, especially a good Muslim woman, should submit to that. And because in our hearts we did feel a necessary connection between ourselves and the sacred, there are a lot of Muslim women who would do absolutely nothing about the incongruence in their lives to all of the values and principles that we're always talking about. You don't know how many times in Belgium women, people reminded me, Muslim women have had their rights in Islam all along. maybe Islam gave it to us, but somehow Muslim men and Muslim codes and Muslim culture and Muslim society and ignorance and the pressure of colonialism took a lot of those rights away from us. So maybe it gave it to us, but we weren't experiencing them. And the challenge of taking agency with regard to how Islam is defined is something that is an important distinction between what I call Islamic and what many of us call Islamic feminism today. In fact, it is an explicit knowledge production project, a project that says that when the Prophet, upon him be peace, received the Quran as revelation from God, that revelation was intended for all humankind, and that however that revelation and the Prophet's behavior or sunnah and the statements of the Prophet, the hadith, however those things were transmitted to us and eventually established into codes, was always a reflection of human agency, disproportionately owned by men, and a very masculinist perspective of how best to fulfill the objectives of that Islam. So by going back into our tradition to actually take first-hand stock of the primary sources of Islam, which was work I was engaged in before I even thought about Islamic feminism, and myself and others, to go back and to take agency with regard to how those primary sources come into action in our homes, in our families, in our communities, in our nation states, in our world, was and is one of the important distinctions of Islamic feminism from the other two voices. Because the other two voices, both secular Muslim feminists and Islamists, assumed an interpretation of Islam which was very patriarchal as being indispensable with Islam itself.
Dans le contexte de 1995 et de la conférence de Pékin, donc se met en place un groupe de Sisters in Islam, donc de sœurs en islam, en particulier avec la Malaisie, qui n'est pas le pays d'origine de Amina Wadud, qui est états-unienne. Ce mouvement rencontre des résistances à la fois du côté des islamistes, pour qui ce discours, au fond, ne se différencie pas de celui des féministes laïques, et symétriquement des résistances du côté des féministes laïques, pour qui, au fond, ça n'est qu'une variante de l'islamisme. Donc ce qu'il s'agit de faire, c'est de récuser cette alternative, et en particulier autour d'une question d'épistémologie, puisque la question essentielle, c'est de savoir qui définit l'islam, qui définit les droits humains. Et donc, il se pose une question d'agency, le terme parfois traduit par capacité à agir ou puissance d'agir. Ici, peut-être qu'on pourrait dire simplement de prendre la main. Et l'exemple qui est choisi ensuite, c'est celui du 11 septembre. Quelques hommes qui ont commis un acte qui a rencontré une désapprobation presque unanime et qui, de fait, ont semblé contribuer à définir ce qu'était l'islam. Et donc, la question était de savoir quel islam nommait-il de la sorte. Ça a eu des conséquences bien réelles, puisque les États-Unis ont ensuite envahi deux pays à majorité musulmane, l'Afghanistan et l'Irak, et avec l'idée que c'était d'une part au nom de la démocratie et d'autre part, plus particulièrement, au nom des droits des femmes. Donc, un tel acte a pu contribuer à définir ce qu'était l'islam, et la question, c'est donc de trouver une manière de retrouver de l'agency, donc de reprendre la main pour définir ce qu'est l'islam, pour redéfinir ce qu'est l'islam, et donc pour se définir soi-même pour les femmes, puisque, au fond, il ne s'agit pas de laisser d'autres définir ce que c'est qu'un bon musulman ou ce que c'est qu'une bonne musulmane. Ce projet, il peut être décrit comme un projet de production de connaissances. Et en particulier, ça veut dire qu'il faut revenir à une révélation qui, sans doute, est censée s'adresser à l'ensemble de l'humanité, mais dont les interprétations successives ont reflété une agency, donc une intervention humaine, qui a été très largement définie par une domination masculine. D'où l'intérêt pour Amina Wadud, qui précédait d'ailleurs ce moment, mais pour les sources primaires de l'islam, pour les réinterpréter et remettre de l'agency féminine dans ce projet.
So just because somebody says they're doing something in the name of Islam, or somebody says they're doing something in the name of democracy or women's rights, doesn't mean that you do not also have the possibility of questioning what do they mean by democracy, what do they mean by Islam, what do they mean by human rights. And so this is where we arrive at the beginning of the 21st century, where the possibility not only of reviewing all of these grand value systems is before us, but also a certain mandate where the status of Muslim women in society is almost unconditionally second class across the board, can be challenged using our own understandings both of these major terms, but also of the methodology whereby you achieve justice in society. If you get a chance, I hope you will look at the website for musawa.org. It's just called www.musawa.org, which is the launching of a movement for equality in Muslim family. At the end of the 20th century, when these two voices that were in great opposition to each other was encountering Islamic feminism beginning to come into its own more clear agenda, methodology, and application, an important caveat to the interpretation of anything that would be applied to living persons, be they laws in the context of civil constitutional construction, or be they Islam in the context of Muslim personal status laws or Muslim family laws. Our Islamic tradition is one in which arriving at laws became early very important. Within a few hundred years of the Prophet, we began the development of Islamic law. Unfortunately, with the Islamist movement, there was an obscurity presented that said that what we want to establish is a nation under Sharia. Sharia cannot be implemented, cannot be enforced. Sharia is like the grand scheme. It's sort of like the Tao in Taoism. It is the way. And if you think about it, the word Sharia and the word Sharia come from the same origin. The original meaning of the word Sharia is a path that leads to water, water being the source of all life. So Sharia is like the divine way. What the Islamist movement is trying to implement is actually called fiqh. And fiqh is the human understanding of the divine way. Coincidentally, much of the fiqh, especially in terms of Muslim personal status law that was codified during the developments of the nation state and the end of colonialism, much of the fiqh is irreparably patriarchal, understanding family as operating only as a system of unequal relations with a specific head that had to be the man, and a woman who, in order to be a member of that family, had to defer to this leadership of the man. In many ways I will not even begin to go into. And part of the Musawa movement is to actually examine the origins of those notions and to determine at the same time a clear methodology of establishing a notion of family based on equality and reciprocity. Now, I'm never going to have time to tell you all the details of this. That's why I hope you refer to the website. But I will give you a few glimpses. Ibn Qayyum al-Jawziyah said that the goal of Islamic Sharia, that is the divine system, the divine way, the goal is justice. And that if there is injustice, then it is not Sharia. This is called the maqasid, the goal of Sharia. What we are working on now in terms of Islamic feminism is clarifying that the notion of justice codified in Islamic family law 1,000 years ago, 800 years ago, reinscribed after colonialism and the beginning of the nation state, is based on one of women's protection. That somehow she's a pearl or something that needs to be protected. I don't know from what. But the idea of justice is not one of reciprocity. The idea of justice is one of protectorate. And maybe there were some things she needed to be protected from. But it is clear that we understand certain things about what it means to be a human being today, and that the Quran establishes certain ideas about what it means to be a human being, which we can apply today, that establishes each person in a direct relationship with his or her creator as a khalifa, as an agent, a moral agent. So that is what the Quran says a human being is, an agent before God. How women's full agency became the subjectivity of men, that's another lecture. But rethinking Muslim family was not the project of either secularist Muslim feminists or Islamists. In fact, both of them acquiesced to unequal family relations, and secular feminists focused on women's access to the public space. So the public space should be equally accessible to Muslim women in order for there to be equality. But the private space was still very patriarchal. And Islamists said, and that is wise, because that is how God wanted it. And so we are challenging any laws, be they understood to be Islamic or be they understood to be civil or constitutional. We are challenging any laws and any practices, that is, any customs that establishes anything other than full humanity for each other. So if families in Islam are understood to be hierarchical, there is a reason, and I can trace those reasons. However, from those same sources, the idea of establishing family as a relationship between equals can be developed, and it would not only be Islamic, but it would also fulfill the kinds of notions being ascribed under the CEDAW, the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. So we're not borrowing from CEDAW. We are, in fact, articulating our own, because the root source is actually establishing full agency over the definitions of Islam. And that two things: no Islam can be implemented against me unless I have a say in what those conclusions will be. So every Muslim woman is an agent of any law that should be ascribed to her, and she has a chance to speak back. Why? Because of number two. Women's lived reality, okay, their lived reality has demonstrated that the models of family and of nation state and citizenship that Muslim women have been living under is not one that has fully recognized her equality before God. So therefore, it is under a mandate of understanding this relationship to God that we are requiring a reform in laws, both in terms of the nation state, but also in terms of the family, as well as a reform of attitudes and customs and practices that will allow us to fulfill that which is the mandate before God, that we be full agents before God. And that is actually my concluding remark.
Is that how you spell it? MusAwa.com?
No, M-U-S-A-W-H. One S.
M-U-S-A-W-H-A?
A-W-A-H.
A-H, I'm sorry. Okay.
Yes.
Sorry. Donc, pour résumer la dernière section de cette intervention, la question, donc, c'est lorsqu'on entend des gens qui parlent soit au nom de la démocratie et des droits humains, soit au nom de l'islam, de se demander et de leur demander ce qu'ils entendent par là. Autrement dit, de remettre en cause, et de remettre en cause en particulier le statut des femmes dans la société implique une méthodologie pour préciser ce que veut dire la justice. Ici, Amina Wadud renvoie à un site, donc je viens de vérifier l'orthographe pour ne pas vous donner une information inexacte, www.musawa, qui s'écrit musawah.com. .org, pardon, .org. Donc j'avais vérifié le reste, mais pas .com. Donc c'est org. Oui, bien sûr. musawah.org. C'est un site où vous trouverez un certain nombre d'éléments développés